The void of space is never silent. Even in the cold gulfs between stars, a whisper echoes, the hollow toll of lives extinguished in the service of an empire that demands perfection, obedience, and sacrifice beyond mortal comprehension. On worlds bathed in the light of distant suns, or choked in the perpetual shadows of hive cities, men and women tremble under the weight of the Emperor's gaze. To defy him is to invite not merely death but erasure, an unraveling of identity so complete that memory itself shuns the offender. And yet, throughout the countless millennia of the Imperium, souls have faltered. Rumors drift through data slates and whispered liturgies, of Adeptus Custodes who deliver judgment without mercy, of Scitari who purge with unfeeling precision, of Astra Militarum regiments torn apart by unseen retribution. What is the price when the will of the Emperor meets the frailty of man? What horrors await those who assume they can escape his vigilance? If the chill of that question reaches you, if your curiosity is stirred by the echoes of distant worlds and the cries of the condemned, then journey with us into the shadows where duty becomes torment and defiance invites annihilation. Like, share, and subscribe to ensure that none of these truths, shrouded as they are in rumor and fear, are lost to the silence. The story unfolds across 11 chapters, each a thread in the tapestry of obedience and punishment. From the ground-level struggle of survival and immediate threat, to the whispered metaphysics of the Emperor's apotheosis, each chapter will plunge you deeper into the consequences of defiance and the unseen machinery of his justice. The corridors of Hive Helios were a labyrinth of soot and steel, a vertical city stacked upon itself like a monument to both human ingenuity and despair. Each level pulsed with the ceaseless rhythm of labor, the hiss of pneumatic presses, the grind of cog-driven machinery, the low hum of servitors carrying endless loads of raw materials. The air was heavy with the acrid tang of promethium, soot settling in every fold of clothing, every hair, every lung, and yet the citizens breathed on, obediently, as if the smoke itself were a holy veil. In these lower tiers, sunlight had long since been a memory. The only illumination came from flickering lamps, their lenses streaked with grime, and the intermittent flare of welding torches that cast jagged shadows against the corrugated metal walls. Marek, a young laborer of the forges, moved with the practiced care of someone who understood that one misstep in the heart of the manufactorum could cost not only his life, but the approval of unseen eyes. Even in the shadows there was no true concealment. The Emperor's gaze, transmitted through the vigilance of machine and man alike, was said to stretch into every corner. Marek's boots echoed against the grated walkways, mingling with the metallic cries of the machinery, and for a fleeting instant he felt the strange, almost unbearable sensation of being both invisible and observed at once. He had heard whispers among his fellow workers, hushed tales of a rebellion simmering in the Undercity. Nothing official, nothing recorded on the data slates, merely murmurs passed from lip to ear over the vox grills, stories of defiance too quiet to draw the attention of the Adeptus Arbits, yet too palpable to ignore. Tonight the air was charged with a different tension. The hum of the forges was punctuated by irregular metallic clangs, sparks flying from damaged servo arms as if the machines themselves were rebelling. Marek paused at the edge of the catwalk, peering down into the pit where the lower laborers toiled. Faces streaked with grime, eyes wide with exhaustion, they bent over their work with religious precision. And yet in their posture, in the rigid line of shoulders and the tense curl of fists, there was something more. An undercurrent of fear, yes, but also a flicker of uncertainty, of questioning. To doubt the Emperor's will, even for a heartbeat, was the gravest sin, and yet here it lurked, like a shadow behind every rivet and girder. He moved further along the walkway, the vibration of machinery beneath his boots almost hypnotic, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the hive itself. The whispers of rebellion reached him through the ambient noise, filtered and distorted by the layers of steel and stone. Rumors of unsanctioned gatherings, of laborers refusing orders in small, almost imperceptible ways. Stopping a gear, redirecting a servitor, delaying a shipment were enough to draw attention, yet they persisted, carried like sparks in dry tinder. In the shadows, Marek thought he saw a figure crouched beside a maintenance hatch, hooded and still watching. He blinked and it was gone. Perhaps it had never been there. Perhaps it had been the smoke twisting in the lamplight, a trick of his weary mind. But the memory of that gaze, fleeting and intent, refused to fade. Below, The forges roared and hissed, swallowing voices and fears alike. Marek descended a grated stairwell, inhaling the metallic tang of iron and the chemical bite of promethium, feeling the heat press against his back. The lower levels were a crucible, where obedience was hammered into the marrow of flesh alongside the raw steel. Here, one wrong word, one slight hesitation could draw the attention of a passing Arbite patrol or a custodian dispatched for oversight. The hive was alive with the smell of burning, the groan of stressed girders, and in that cacophony, the faintest sound carried, the whisper of dissent. Marek paused before the service door leading to the central conduit. A line of servitors passed through, their movements automatic, their heads swiveling with mechanical precision. Their servos hissed and joints creaked, the faint sparks of their internal welders reflected in his eyes. They were the perfect image of obedience, yet Marek wondered what price had been paid for that perfection. Human or machine, all were instruments of the same will. The same impossible standard, and the cost of deviation was a concept only fully understood when it consumed a life. He stepped into the conduit, and the shadows seemed to close around him. The heat from the lower forges radiated upward, and he smelled the faintest hint of burning hair, of flesh caught too close to an overactive press. He remembered the stories. Workers who vanished, taken in the dead of night, their disappearances explained as accidents. And yet, in the hushed tones of those who survived, it was said they had been judged by whom or by what. No one could say for certain. Some claimed fragments of the Emperor's will, walking invisibly through the hive, dispensing justice where human oversight could not reach. Marek did not know if these stories were true, only that the fear they inspired was. Every step forward pressed him deeper into the unknown, into corridors where the lights flickered and the machinery whispered secrets, into spaces where the shadow of rebellion grew thin yet insistent. He felt eyes on him, not human eyes, but the weight of expectation, of judgment pressing from all directions. In the silence between the clanging of servitors and the hiss of promethium, he heard the faintest murmur, the tremor of dissent, the whisper of defiance, the first shadow of consequences yet to come. And as he descended, Marek understood that the hive itself was watching, waiting, and in that instant, he felt the terrifying gravity of the Emperor's will. Ever patient, ever watching, and utterly inexorable, the shadows shifted. A distant alarm clanged somewhere below, vibrating through the metal spine of the hive. It could have been a malfunction, or it could have been something far more deliberate. Marek's pulse quickened, a rhythm matching the industrial heart of Helios itself. Somewhere in the maze of steel, someone had stepped beyond obedience, and the first threads of reckoning were beginning to unravel. And in the corridors, under the unblinking light of the flickering lamps, he realized that for the defiant, for those who dared to question even silently, survival had never been guaranteed, and the price of defiance would be written in fire, blood, and the unyielding shadow of the Emperor. The vox grills of Hive Helios were alive with whispers, a constant tangled hum of voices carried across miles of steel and concrete. Orders, warnings, casual remarks, all interlaced with the quiet murmur of secrets, some too dangerous to be recorded in official logs. The grills were meant to serve the machinery of the Imperium, a network of communication ensuring obedience, efficiency, and vigilance. Yet in the hands of the desperate, the fearful, or the bold, these devices became conduits for information that was never intended to exist. Gossip, speculation, the fragile beginnings of defiance. Marek had learned the subtle art of listening without being noticed. The vox slates clutched in the hands of fellow laborers carried faint signals, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident, and each carried a fragment of truth, or the shadow of it. He could hear the tremor in a voice as it spoke of missing co-workers, the barely perceptible hesitation that betrayed knowledge of unrecorded disappearances, the quiet panic when someone realized a custodian had passed too close. In the labyrinthine corridors beneath the manufactorum, these fragments of sound stitched themselves into a tapestry of fear and speculation, a pattern visible only to those willing to look for it. A muffled argument drifted from a nearby grill, the vox hum reducing it to static-laced syllables. "Can't continue like this. Risk is too high." The words cut and recombined through the feedback, leaving only the sense of urgent dissent. Marek pressed closer to the grill, careful to avoid its directional sensors, and caught a few more details. Names, locations, small alterations to schedules that could mean life or death. Here, in these corridors, loyalty was both weapon and vulnerability, and every fragment of disobedience was a spark that could ignite a furnace of punishment. The secrets of the hive were not merely human in origin. The servitors, with their coldly precise servos and integrated data slates, were capable of transmitting more than just mechanical readings. Some murmured that fragments of the Emperor's will or his servants could use the Vox network to observe, to judge. It was impossible to tell where rumor ended and truth began. Still, every worker knew that every whispered syllable carried risk. A casual phrase could be overheard by a Skitarii on patrol, logged, and reported. The act of speaking itself became a calculated gamble, a silent plea to the invisible eyes that watched the hive's endless labyrinth. Merrick moved through the twisting metal halls, noting the tiny irregularities that signaled someone had been there before him. A loose bolt, a footprint in the grime, a servitor slightly out of alignment. Each told a story, fragments of rebellion and fear pressed into the skin of the hive. He paused at a maintenance hub where a cadre of laborers huddled near a grill, their whispers a soft static against the hum of machinery. They spoke of disappearances in hushed tones, of Arbite's patrols arriving without warning, of the inexplicable deaths of servitors in areas under strict surveillance. The stories were contradictory, yet their shared fear made them believable. It was not merely the fear of punishment that haunted these whispers. There was a creeping doubt, a questioning that no prayer could fully quell. What power truly oversaw the lower levels? Were the disappearances merely administrative? Or was there some fragment of the Emperor himself walking unseen among the corridors, meting out judgment where mortal oversight failed? The idea was terrifying, yet intoxicating, and even those who believed in his omniscience could not shake the question, could they evade his notice even for a single moment? Marek's pulse quickened as he passed a grill that emitted an unfamiliar signal, a distorted set of tones he had never encountered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible beneath the industrial hum, but enough to make him halt. His fingers hovered over the Vox controls, his instincts screaming caution. The signal repeated, faint yet insistent, as if drawing him toward the source. Whoever had sent it had knowledge, perhaps of the rebellion, perhaps of something far darker. The conduit beyond the grill led to a narrow service tunnel, choked with pipes and conduits that hummed with energy, and he descended, every nerve alert, feeling the oppressive weight of the hive pressing around him. The air grew hotter, metallic, and oppressive. Marek's ears picked up the faint clicks and whirs of distant machinery. But there was something else, a whisper that seemed to move against the rhythm of the Vox, an irregularity almost imperceptible to the untrained ear. It carried names, locations, accusations, small details of lives already marked by unseen judgment. He pressed closer to the conduit wall, listening, memorizing, realizing that the hive itself was not merely a building, but a repository of surveillance, both mechanical and spiritual. Every secret, every hesitation, every stolen glance might be transmitted upward toward unknown eyes, and every act of defiance was slowly being mapped. As he emerged into a junction connecting several lower levels, Merrick glimpsed the faint shimmer of heat from machinery, and in that glare he thought he saw a figure, an unmarked Arbite, or perhaps a fragment of something less corporeal, moving with deliberate grace through the shadows. His breath caught. Was it watching him? Or was it simply a shadow, a trick of the light refracted by the molten promethium and steel? In the hive, the distinction was irrelevant. What mattered was the knowledge that someone, or something, was aware, and that even the faintest act of rebellion, even the most secretive whisper, could trigger a response whose speed and severity were beyond comprehension. Marek moved on, silent, careful and ever aware of the weight pressing down from above, from below, from every corner. The secrets of the Vox grills had given him insight, yes, but also unease. He understood now that knowledge carried its own price, and that the very act of listening placed him closer to the edge of judgment. Somewhere in the endless corridors of Hive Helios, the Emperor's will, or what men feared of it, was patient, deliberate, and unyielding. And for those who dared to hear, to question, or to act, the cost would come sooner than they could imagine. The roar of flames tore through the lower levels of Hive Helios with a ferocity that even the relentless machinery could not drown out. Sparks showered across scorched metal walkways, hissed as they struck pools of spilled promethium, and ignited. Clouds of smoke that filled the corridors with a choking, acrid fog. Servitors clanked through the haze, their hydraulic joints groaning under the heat, attempting to contain the conflagration with unerring mechanical precision. For the laborers trapped in the manufactorum, every step became a trial, every breath a gamble, and the air itself seemed to hum with imminent danger. Marek pressed against the wall, the heat pressing against his back like a living thing. He could smell the faint, unmistakable tang of burning flesh beneath the stronger scent of promethium and charred metal, and the reality of what he was witnessing hit him with the same blunt force as the heat that singed his skin. The fire was indiscriminate, devouring servitors and machinery alike, yet it was also selective in its consequences. Whispers ran through the corridors. Some had survived only because of deliberate placement, because the flames had spared them for reasons inscrutable to human understanding. Others, less fortunate, had been consumed in an instant, leaving nothing but scorched metal and the faint echoes of their screams. Through the smoke, Marek glimpsed figures moving with unnatural calm. Custodes, their gilded armor reflecting the infernal light, strode through the chaos as though untouched by it, their presence both terrifying and reassuring in its inevitability. Where they passed, laborers instinctively flattened themselves against walls, whispering prayers, murmuring litanies to the Emperor. Every movement was watched, every hesitation noted. The fire was more than a physical threat. It was a crucible designed to test not only survival, but loyalty. Defiance, whether in thought or action, had no sanctuary here. He stumbled over the remains of a servitor, its servos fused and sparking, and found himself at the entrance to a narrow maintenance shaft. Smoke poured from it like liquid shadow, curling upward and carrying the scent of melted alloys and scorched flesh. Marek took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the mechanics of movement, on the necessity of survival. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet every step was measured, deliberate, as if the hive itself had become an extension of the Emperor's will, guiding the obedient and punishing the hesitant. The heat pressed harder, and with it came the realization that the fire was not merely accidental. Sparks leaped from a ruptured conduit, flames licking across the promethium-soaked floor with alarming speed. Someone, or something, had lit this inferno intentionally, and the pattern of destruction suggested more than mere chaos. It was a message, a warning, or perhaps a test. Marek did not have the luxury of pondering which. Each second in the corridor could mean the difference between life and incineration. Beyond the flames, he glimpsed the faint silhouettes of other laborers, shadows moving frantically, scrambling over fallen girders, helping the injured where they could. Their faces were pale with soot and terror, eyes wide, lips moving in silent prayers. He caught fragments of their words, mentions of missing co-workers, of sudden disappearances, of retribution for acts of quiet rebellion. The fire had made the consequences immediate, tangible. It was no longer theory, no longer rumor whispered over vox grills. It was reality, embodied in heat, smoke, and screaming metal. Marek forced himself forward, navigating the twisted corridors with care. The fire shifted with a life of its own, flames surging unpredictably, as though aware of those who dared traverse its path. He passed a scorched doorway where a cadre of Skitari had halted, their augmetic eyes scanning the devastation, weapons held at the ready. They moved with mechanical efficiency, targeting not only the blaze but any perceived deviation from protocol. Marek realized then that survival alone was insufficient. Compliance, measured, silent, and absolute, was the only path through this crucible. The lower manufactorum trembled with each footstep and flare of promethium. Sparks danced across the metal like fleeting stars, illuminating the horror of what obedience demanded. Marek's lungs burned with smoke, but his mind burned with the recognition of the larger truth. This fire, like so many punishments in the Imperium, was not a random hazard. It was deliberate. Every inferno, every broken servitor, every scream carried a lesson. Defiance, even small and hidden, had its price, and the Emperor's patience was as scorching and unyielding as the promethium that enveloped the hive. At last, Marek emerged into a chamber partially shielded from the worst of the flames. The air was thick, oppressive, yet the relative calm allowed him a moment to see the devastation in its entirety. Charred machinery, twisted metal, scorched servitors, and terrified humans littered the floor. And amid it all, the faint glimmer of Custodes and Scitari moving with deliberate purpose, ensuring that survival and obedience were inseparable. In that moment, Marek understood with clarity. The fire was both literal and symbolic, a tangible manifestation of the cost of defiance, a crucible that purified not just metal but the soul. He inhaled deeply, tasting soot and fear, and pressed onward. The flames had revealed the fragility of life in the hive, yet they also hinted at the power that watched, measured, and judged every action. For those who dared to defy, even silently, the inferno was a warning, a test, and a promise of consequences yet to unfold. Marek knew that the shadows waiting beyond this fire would be darker, the price of rebellion heavier, and the Emperor's will more exacting than anything he had yet witnessed. Beyond the roar of flames and the clatter of machinery, a deeper, more insidious presence haunted Hive Helios. It was not fire, nor servitor, nor the ever-watchful Scitari. It was something subtler, woven into the very structure of the manufactorum and the corridors above. The workers whispered of it in fear-soaked tones, calling it the Emperor's shadow, a fragment of his will manifest, unseen, moving with an awareness beyond mortal comprehension. Some dismissed it as superstition, the desperate imaginings of minds bent under the unyielding weight of labor and fear. Others swore with trembling certainty that the shadow passed through the halls, and that to see it, even indirectly, was to feel the unblinking gaze of judgment. Marek moved cautiously through the upper tiers, the air cooler here but no less charged. Machinery hummed with routine efficiency. Lights flickered in timed sequences, and the Vox grills carried the static-laced hum of communications. Yet beneath these ordinary sounds, a resonance lingered. Subtle but unmistakable, a pressure in the chest, a tingle along the spine, the sense that unseen eyes measured every movement, every breath, every thought. The shadow was not corporeal. It did not walk in boots or wield a weapon. It did not need to. Its presence alone sufficed, an invisible blade suspended above those who dared falter. Stories of the Emperor's shadow varied with the teller. Some said it took the form of a man, golden-eyed and silent, striding through corridors that appeared empty. Others described it as a cold warmth, a sensation that brushed along the skin, leaving gooseflesh and unease in its wake. Occasionally, those who claimed to encounter it disappeared shortly afterward, leaving nothing but scorched servitors and the faint traces of a footprint or a misplaced bolt. Whether it was a fragment of the Emperor himself, an emissary of his will, or merely rumor made flesh, the effect was the same: fear, obedience, and vigilance intensified to their breaking points. Marek's path led him to a high balcony overlooking the manufactorum, where the heat of the lower fires could be felt like distant sunbeams pressing through metal and stone. He paused, inhaling the acrid air, listening to the whisper of machinery and human movement, and felt faintly the shift in the atmosphere. There was a presence here, patient, deliberate, unseen yet palpable. It was as if the hive itself had become a vessel for judgment, and every movement he made was being logged in some ineffable ledger of the Emperor's attention. The shadow did not announce itself with fury. It did not demand immediate submission. Instead, it pressed subtly, testing resolve, amplifying fear, bending thoughts into vigilance. Marek thought of the laborers who had whispered of disappearances, of vanished colleagues, of Scitari strikes that seemed almost preternaturally precise. Perhaps it was the Emperor himself, acting through fragments of his perception, correcting deviations that the mortal eye could not perceive. Or perhaps it was a story designed to ensure compliance, a collective hallucination born of necessity and terror. Either way, the effect was undeniable. As he descended into the narrower corridors, the temperature dropped slightly, the hum of the machinery fading into a background drone. Yet the weight of observation remained, pressing against his consciousness like a physical force. Each step became a negotiation between fear and duty, survival and curiosity, obedience and the faint, dangerous spark of questioning. The shadow was patient, waiting for a mistake, a hesitation, a thought unspoken yet evident in the tremor of flesh and bone. Marek glimpsed a cluster of laborers huddled near a service hatch, speaking in hushed tones. They had heard rumors of the shadow, of fragments of the Emperor moving unseen to punish the disobedient. One trembled visibly, clutching a data slate as if it were a talisman. Another's voice broke under the weight of prayer. Litanies rushed and incomprehensible to any but themselves. The presence of the shadow transformed the hive from a structure of industry into a living tribunal, where every action, however small, was a measure of loyalty, and every omission, however innocent, a potential act of heresy. In the distance, the faint echo of Prometheum fire still reached his ears, a reminder of the cost of defiance and the fragility of life beneath the Emperor's will. Marek moved on, each corridor a gauntlet, each step a negotiation with forces unseen. Whether the shadow was real or imagined mattered little. Its effect was as tangible as the heat on his skin, as the tremor of the metal beneath his boots, as the fear that knotted his chest. It was the embodiment of the Emperor's vigilance, patient, deliberate, and utterly inexorable. And as Marek disappeared into the deeper bowels of Hive Helios, he felt it again, the sensation that he was measured, judged, and found wanting, even before any mortal hand could act. The shadow did not strike. It waited silent, a presence felt in every flicker of light and every hiss of machinery. It was the Emperor's will made palpable, a test of faith, fear, and obedience. And in its patient gaze, the boundaries between rumor and reality, faith and fact began to blur, leaving only the certainty that defiance, however small or hidden, would not go unnoticed. In the upper tiers of Hive Helios, the sound of chanting rose like a tide through the hollow corridors, a rhythmic cadence that carried both solace and dread. The litanies of the ecclesiarchy were no mere prayer. They were instruments of observation, a subtle architecture of devotion and detection. Those who faltered even in thought risked exposure. Each syllable carried weight, each pause resonated with scrutiny, and the act of participating or failing to participate was itself a measure of obedience. Marek moved through these corridors with a heightened awareness, sensing the layers of watchfulness that extended beyond the visible custodes and scitari. The liturgists moved with deliberate grace, robes trailing over grated walkways, faces hidden behind masks of solemnity. Their hands traced the air in intricate patterns, fingers brushing against the vox grills and data slates as if conducting an unseen orchestra. Each movement, each whispered word could reveal an unspoken transgression. The faithful understood instinctively that the Emperor's will was mirrored here. Obedience was not merely enforced through muscle and servitor, but through ritual, through sound, and through the silent, unyielding pressure of tradition codified into action. Marek observed a group of laborers performing the mandated morning litanies. Their voices were uniform, trained, and precise, yet a subtle tremor betrayed uncertainty in a few. The liturgists noted the discrepancy with eyes that seemed to pierce deeper than the physical, noting who faltered, who hesitated, who risked thought over obedience. A sudden glance from a passing custodian brought immediate straightening of posture, but it was not enough. The shadow, the ever-present fragment of divine scrutiny, seemed to linger over the hesitant, amplifying fear and compelling attention. Compliance was demanded not by threat alone, but by the invisible calculus of judgment that weighed every syllable of prayer. In the manufactorum, machinery hummed beneath the chants, a counterpoint to the litanies that filled the air. Marek felt the juxtaposition sharply, industrial precision alongside spiritual discipline, both intertwined in a system designed to root out imperfection. Servitors performed their tasks with mechanical exactitude, yet even they were not immune to scrutiny. Misaligned gears, slow response times, or deviations from programmed paths were noted, catalogued, and often interpreted as signs of broader disobedience. Liturgy became more than ritual. It became an instrument of surveillance, a mechanism by which the Emperor's will was realized through devotion as much as through force. He passed a small alcove where a liturgist knelt over a data slate, tracing lines of code with the tip of a gloved finger. The slate emitted faint pulses, analyzing movement patterns, vocal inflections, even heart rhythms. Each reading was layered against the prayers chanted throughout the hive. Deviations were marked. Anomalies recorded, and subtle adjustments were made in the schedules of Arbite's patrols and Scitari assignments. The Emperor's will was everywhere, mediated through both flesh and machine, and liturgy was the silent instrument by which obedience was measured. Marek felt a cold weight in his chest as he continued through the corridors. The flames from the lower levels still glowed faintly, a reminder of the cost of failure, of hesitation, of doubt. The liturgists were patient, methodical, their judgment slow but inevitable. Every deviation, however minor, was catalogued, every thoughtless glance noted, every hesitation logged into an invisible ledger whose consequences would not be known until they manifested in fire, removal, or disappearance. Voices in the corridors whispered of those who had faltered, of laborers and officials who had been judged by these rituals and never returned. The stories varied. Some claimed the Arbites arrived silently, executing judgment without ceremony. Others spoke of Skitarii acting with precise and terrifying efficiency. But the constant was always the same. Liturgy was the lens through which loyalty was measured, a method by which defiance, no matter how quiet or rationalized, was made visible. Marek reached the edge of a balcony overlooking the central forge. From this vantage, he could see the pattern of life and labor below, the interplay of machinery and human effort, and the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts that marked those under judgment. The Emperor's will, transmitted through rituals, observation, and the patient presence of Custodes and Skitarii alike, was inescapable. In this place, prayer was as vital a shield as steel, obedience as binding as chains, and every act of thought that strayed from the expected path was a spark against the inexorable weight of divine scrutiny. The litanies continued to swell, echoing off walls, floor, and ceiling, a living chorus of vigilance. Marek felt the shadow brush against him again, not as threat but as quiet, insistent presence reminding him that liturgy was both instrument and judge. Survival required more than skill or caution. It demanded devotion, attention, and an understanding that in Hive Helios, judgment was never paused, never deferred, and never merciful. Here, obedience was both shield and measure, and those who strayed, even silently, would discover that the consequences of faltering were written in both flesh and fire. Whispers of the Emperor's apotheosis wove through the corridors of Hive Helios like smoke, insubstantial yet impossible to ignore. Among the laborers and clerics in the quiet corners of manufactorums and the flickering light of vox grills, speculation festered. Could the Emperor be more than the flesh upon the golden throne? Could fragments of his consciousness act independently, judging, guiding, punishing, or even glimpsing thoughts too fleeting for mortal eyes to register? No official record confirmed such notions. The ecclesiarchy discouraged inquiry, and the Adeptus Custodes dismissed rumor as irrelevance. And yet, for those pressed into the unyielding rhythm of the hive, the whispers were as real as heat and steel. Marek had heard them first from a barely perceptible murmuring among laborers high above the lower forges. Some spoke in terrified reverence of figures glimpsed at impossible angles, silhouettes that could not belong to mortal flesh, yet moved with the precision of custodes and the awareness of something far greater. Others claimed to see impressions left on the walls, shapes that shifted when unobserved, patterns that suggested attention without presence. The stories carried weight precisely because they were unverifiable. Belief and fear intertwined into something almost tangible, pressing upon the mind with the subtle insistence of inevitability. He moved through the upper tiers, past corridors thick with the hum of machinery, past the echoes of liturgy that still lingered from earlier hours. The air here was cooler, drier, yet it carried the same oppressive weight of observation. Every footstep seemed to awaken the memory of whispered tales, fragments of the Emperor wandering unseen, passing judgment where mortal eyes could not reach, correcting imperfections with patience and precision that no human could match. Were these visions real or merely the imagination strained by exhaustion, fear, and the omnipresent sense of consequence? The distinction mattered little. The impact was the same. Laborers straightened, voices faltered into silent prayer, and thoughts of defiance were suppressed as instinctively as a servitor following protocol. Even among the clergy, rumors were carried like secret prayers, words shared in hushed tones that might never be recorded on data slates, but were repeated enough to weave a subtle current of belief. Some suggested that fragments of the Emperor could occupy multiple loci simultaneously, invisible custodians threading through manufactorums and corridors, observing, judging, weighing the merit of actions and inactions alike. Others argued that the very hive itself, with its network of machinery, vox grills, and surveillance, could channel a portion of his consciousness, an extension of divine will that rendered secrecy impossible. These were not teachings sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy. They were seeds of awe and terror, nourishing themselves on the human capacity for wonder and dread. Marek paused near a junction where the shadows deepened and the hum of servitors faltered. He recalled a laborer's whisper of a fragment glimpsed moving through the conduit, its form ambiguous, its presence undeniable. The memory pressed against him, raising gooseflesh along his arms. Even now, after months of immersion in the hive, he could not dismiss it. Perhaps it had been the shadow, perhaps the imagination, perhaps something else entirely. But the uncertainty itself carried authority. The Emperor, even from the Golden Throne, demanded that doubt be treated as treachery until proven loyalty. The rumors shaped behavior with the subtlety of gravity. Those who believed, or even feared belief, walked straighter, spoke more cautiously, and observed with a hyper-awareness that left no room for private thought. Marek noted that even among the most disciplined, the faintest hesitation, a skipped step, a faltered prayer, a glance too long, was enough to provoke anxiety. In a system where judgment was omnipresent, both corporeal and metaphysical, the line between superstition and reality blurred into a single imperative: obedience. Yet the whispers carried another dimension: hope, or perhaps hubris. If fragments of the Emperor's mind truly moved among the corridors, did that mean mercy was possible? Could the subtle intervention of divine cognition prevent accidents, misjudgments, or misfortune? The thought was fleeting. It carried risk, for even speculation could be interpreted as questioning. Marek pressed onward, every sense attuned, every step deliberate. Whether real or imagined, the rumors of apotheosis were not idle musings. They were a force, a presence shaping the behavior, the fear, and the devotion of every living being in the hive. As he emerged onto a catwalk overlooking a silent chamber, the faint glow of molten promethium from the lower levels illuminated the walls in flickering gold and crimson. Shadows moved in impossible angles, mechanical and organic, indistinct yet purposeful. Marek felt the weight again, subtle and pervasive, the sense of being observed by something beyond flesh, beyond reason, beyond mortal judgment. Whether it was the shadow, a fragment of the Emperor, or merely the fear it inspired, one fact was clear: obedience was no longer simply survival. It was devotion, instinct, and acknowledgement of a presence whose full nature would never be confirmed. The Emperor's will, fragmented or absolute, was patient, eternal, and inescapable. Orders arrived without warning, carried through the hive like the cold whisper of inevitability. Skitarii detachments advanced through the corridors with mechanical precision, augmented limbs and augmetic optics scanning every surface, every shadow, every wavering silhouette. Custodes moved silently among them, their gilded armor catching the dim light of the manufactorum, each step resonating like a measured heartbeat of judgment. In Hive Helios, survival had always demanded vigilance, but now compliance was not enough. Obedience alone could not save the trembling laborers who had dared even the smallest deviation from expected protocol. Marek pressed against the wall as a patrol passed, the heat from the lower fires still rising in waves, carrying with it the lingering scent of burned promethium and metal. The Custodes' eyes seemed to sweep beyond the mortal realm, taking in every tremor of posture, every flicker of hesitation. The Skitarii recorded every detail, their mechanical voices a faint hum beneath the din of labor and machinery. Any act of disobedience, an overlooked instruction, a whispered rumor, a faltered prayer, was no longer a matter for rumor or warning. The purge had begun, swift, absolute, and irrevocable. The corridors erupted in controlled chaos. Servitors redirected machinery, extinguishing small fires while simultaneously herding laborers into designated zones. Those who faltered were not spared. Even a moment of hesitation drew attention, and the Skitarii were unrelenting. Las rifles discharged in calculated bursts, not indiscriminately, but with the precision that left no one who had strayed from compliance unscathed. Sparks from weapon discharges illuminated the shocked faces of laborers, the glint of steel and gold, the faint shimmer of heat from scorched metal. The purge was both punishment and demonstration, a lesson written in flame, metal, and blood. Marek observed as a group of huddled laborers was addressed by a custodian. The officer's gaze swept over them, and with barely perceptible motion, a mechanism in the floor shifted, releasing a cloud of smoke that contained anesthetic properties. Some slumped unconscious, their bodies preserved from immediate death but marked for later scrutiny or indoctrination. Others, deemed beyond correction, were removed in silence, carried through the corridors with mechanical detachment, never to return. The hive had become a theater of judgment, a crucible in which obedience and survival were inseparable, and defiance was met with precision-sanctioned eradication. The purge extended beyond the physical. Data slates and vox grills recorded anomalies, deviations, even misaligned work patterns. The liturgists' rituals intensified, their litanies tracing the pulse of fear through the corridors, highlighting those whose faith or attention faltered. Every measurement, every reading, every prayer was cross-referenced and analyzed, ensuring that the Emperor's will, whether through shadow, custodian, or rumor, was executed with relentless consistency. Marek felt the weight of scrutiny like a physical force pressing upon his shoulders. Every breath, every glance, every heartbeat was measured, catalogued, and judged. As he moved deeper into the hive, Marek witnessed the aftermath of earlier strikes: scorched floors where laborers had been removed, servitors rebooting amidst twisted metal, and flickering lights that cast ghostly shadows on walls still hot from fire. Some of the removed had been suspected of whispering, of pausing in prayer, of thinking beyond the immediate demands of labor. In a system where judgment was absolute, thought itself could be treacherous. The purge was not chaotic. It was deliberate, an orchestration of fear and obedience that left no space for dissent. The corridor seemed to close in as he advanced, the heat from below pressing upward, the shadows stretching unnaturally, and the hum of servitors creating a constant reminder of the hive's vigilance. Marek understood that survival was not simply a matter of skill or agility, but of awareness, anticipation, and submission to forces both seen and unseen. Each Skitarii patrol, each custodian stride, each shadowed corner of observation reinforced the lesson. The Emperor's will was enacted with a precision that was both terrifying and absolute. The time Marek reached the junction leading toward the manufactorum's upper levels, the scale of the purge was evident. The corridors, once crowded with laborers and the rhythm of work, were now punctuated by silence, broken only by the hiss of servitors and the occasional clank of distant movement. Fear had become obedience. Obedience had become ritual, and defiance, however small, however silent, had been purged with unyielding efficiency. The hive, for all its noise and fire, had been reminded of its place beneath the Emperor's gaze, and Marek felt the chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. In the quiet aftermath, as heat and smoke slowly receded, the message was clear: deviation, no matter how minor, would not be tolerated. Compliance was no longer enough. Vigilance, devotion, and absolute obedience were the only paths to survival. And for those who still whispered, still doubted, still considered rebellion, the purges of Hive Helios would serve as both warning and precedent, a reminder that the Emperor's will was absolute, and the cost of disobedience was swift, meticulous, and final. In the aftermath of the purge, Hive Helios was transformed. The corridors, once alive with the ceaseless rhythm of labor and whispered rumor, now carried a heavier cadence, a subdued harmony of fear and obedience that resonated through every grate and conduit. The echoes of the Imperium, both literal and metaphorical, pressed upon Marek as he navigated the upper tiers. Every clang of machinery, every hiss of steam, every faint pulse of the vox grills reverberated with memory, the memory of punishment, of judgment, of survival dictated by forces too vast to comprehend fully. Marek's senses were sharpened to a razor's edge. The air, thick with the scent of promethium and lingering smoke, seemed almost alive, vibrating with the remnants of past infernos and the ghosts of those who had been removed. The machinery, once indifferent, now seemed to hum with a spectral awareness, responding subtly to hesitation, to misstep, to doubt. The Custodes and Skitarii moved through the upper corridors with the quiet inevitability of law-made flesh, their presence a constant reminder that the Emperor's will extended beyond flesh and fire, beyond mortal comprehension. Through the vox grills, fragmented reports of other hive sectors reached Marek, carried with the static-laced inflection of urgency. Fires, disappearances, and unexplained mechanical failures had rippled across neighboring manufactorums, evidence of the Imperium's reach and the consequences of failing even the smallest of expectations. Rumors whispered of fragments of the Emperor acting simultaneously in distant corridors, invisible yet all-seeing, meeting judgment through indirect means and mechanical proxies alike. The stories varied in detail, but the impression was universal. The Imperium's presence was absolute, inexorable, and inescapable. Marek paused at a junction overlooking a massive forge where servitors labored under the shadow of a custodian. The golden armor reflected the flickering lights, creating the illusion of a living flame. Even as the machines moved with unerring precision, there was an atmosphere of silent reverence, as if every gear, every hydraulic hiss, every hiss of steam were components of a larger ritual. The Emperor's will was not only enforced through fire and judgment, but through expectation and observation, a subtle architecture of control that rendered the hive both living and obedient. In quieter corridors, Marek noticed the subtle traces of rumor and fear embedded in the walls themselves. Scorch marks aligned with earlier purges, symbols etched into metal gratings, faint remnants of prayers whispered into vox grills. These echoes formed a lattice of knowledge, unrecorded yet understood by all who survived. It was as if the hive itself remembered. The compliance, the defiance, the punishment, the silent prayers of those who had vanished. And through this lattice, the presence of the Emperor, whether as shadow fragment or unseen awareness, pressed insistently upon every action and thought. Even among those untouched by the purges, vigilance was absolute. Laborers moved with mechanical precision, their devotion sharpened by fear, their prayers more fervent, their glances downward to avoid the gaze of the custodes. Marek understood that the Imperium's echo was not simply a product of memory or rumor. It was a living force shaping behavior, imposing order, and ensuring that even the smallest act of defiance or mere thought of defiance was weighed against the Emperor's inscrutable standards. As he continued through the corridors, the magnitude of the Imperium's presence became almost tangible. The air thrummed with anticipation, each step measured against an invisible scale. Servitors moved in synchrony. Custodes watched silently, and even the machinery seemed to pulse with awareness. The echoes of judgment, of fire and promethium, of whispered rumors and litanies converged in a continuous feedback loop of expectation. In Hive Helios, the past and present were inseparable, and every action resonated into the future, carrying the weight of consequences yet to be realized. Marek paused before a grated doorway leading deeper into the manufactorum. Beyond it, the faint glow of molten metal cast elongated shadows, shapes that seemed to move independently of their sources. He felt again the subtle brush of the shadow, the unblinking presence of an authority beyond human comprehension. The echoes of the Imperium were everywhere, in sound, in light, in shadow, and they carried the same unyielding message. Obedience was absolute, deviation impermissible, and the Emperor's will, whether literal or perceived, would be enacted without mercy or hesitation. Even amid the ceaseless machinery and the echoing cadence of litanies, doubt had begun to creep into the hearts of those who survived. Faith, once a shield against the weight of judgment and fire, now faltered under the relentless pressure of observation, the inexorable presence of the Emperor's shadow, and the unforgiving precision of Scutari and Custodes. Whispers of apotheosis, of fragments acting independently, of unseen purges began to coalesce into questions that were dangerous to voice, yet impossible to suppress. The cracks in devotion were subtle, a hesitation in prayer, a glance downward too long, a murmured doubt. But they were enough to attract scrutiny, and in Hive Helios, scrutiny was rarely benign. Marek noticed the fissures most clearly among the clerics and liturgists. Their chants, once synchronized and unwavering, now faltered at moments. Tiny irregularities in rhythm betraying the inner struggle of minds worn thin by fear, responsibility, and the burden of knowledge. The ecclesiarchy had trained them to maintain absolute composure, to channel doubt into ritual. Yet even they could not entirely escape the fractures that spread like invisible fissures through the hive. Those who sensed the shadow, who glimpsed fragments of the Emperor beyond mortal perception, were caught between awe and terror. The line between reverence and panic blurred, leaving them vulnerable both spiritually and physically. Among the laborers, the effects were no less pronounced. Survival demanded obedience, yet obedience without understanding bred subtle rebellion in thought. Quiet acts of hesitation, small deviations in task performance, and whispered speculation circulated in shadows. The hive, attuned to patterns, detected these minor imperfections, cataloged them, and relayed them upward through the silent networks of vox grills and data slates. Marek could feel the weight of this invisible ledger pressing down with every step he took, a constant reminder that faith was not merely internal. It was enforced externally by systems, machines, and unseen observers whose perception might transcend mortal limits. The fractures were not uniform. Some individuals clung with desperation to ritual, reciting litanies with mechanical precision, finding solace in rote devotion. Others faltered visibly, their fear and uncertainty manifesting in twitching hands, faltering voices, and distracted movements. The Emperor's will, whether through shadow custodes or mechanical intermediaries, seemed to calibrate its observation according to the subtle fluctuations of belief. Those who faltered were noted, not always punished immediately, but their hesitation remained recorded in the lattice of the hive's memory, a stain to be addressed when the time came. Marek himself felt the tension, knowledge of past purges, of whispered apotheosis, of fragments moving unseen, pressed on his mind like an inexorable weight. The balance between fear and faith was delicate. A single misstep in thought could become a chain of consequence. Yet he could not fully suppress his curiosity, his need to observe, understand, and anticipate the forces shaping life in Hive Helios. The fractures in faith became a mirror of his own internal struggle, a test of loyalty and endurance that existed in parallel to the mechanical and ritualized scrutiny surrounding him. The corridors themselves seemed to reflect the fractures, shifting subtly under the hum of machinery, the flicker of lights, and the vibrations of distant promethium fires. Shadows lengthened and contracted unpredictably, and sounds, footsteps, the hiss of steam, the faint echo of prayer, were distorted, creating an atmosphere of unease that penetrated both flesh and mind. In such an environment, belief became an act of discipline, a survival skill, and doubt was a luxury that invited judgment. As Marek moved deeper into the hive, he recognized that these fractures of faith were not merely individual failings. They were part of a larger, almost inevitable pattern. The hive itself, the machinery, the custodes, the Scitari, and perhaps even fragments of the Emperor, shaped obedience and doubt into a continuum. Those who faltered, even silently, contributed to the lattice of fear and devotion, reinforcing the Imperium's inescapable weight. And in the quiet spaces between machinery and ritual, Marek understood the most harrowing truth. Faith was no longer merely spiritual, it was survival. And every fracture was a potential catalyst for judgment. The corridors of Hive Helios were no longer simply pathways of labor. They had become arenas of judgment, each step measured against unseen standards, each breath weighed against the imperceptible will of forces beyond mortal reckoning. Marek moved cautiously, the memory of purges, fires, and whispered rumors of apotheosis pressing upon his mind like a physical force. The shadow, persistent and patient, seemed to follow, not in the form of flesh or machinery, but as a presence that threaded through walls, machinery, and thought. Every flicker of light, every hum of servitor hydraulics, every distant clang carried with it the possibility of observation, the certainty of accountability. In the upper tiers, the Custodes and Scitari had shifted their positions. Patrols were tighter, movements more deliberate, and the faint glow of augmented optics illuminated corridors in patterns that seemed almost preternatural. Marek sensed that the hive itself had become an instrument of scrutiny. The architecture of metal and conduit, the lattices of service tunnels and maintenance shafts, even the flickering light of molten promethium, combined into a single system of observation. Shadows moved unnaturally, shapes that might be physical or might be extensions of judgment. The distinction was meaningless. What mattered was that every deviation, every hesitation, every thought unspoken was under consideration. The whispers of laborers reached him in fragmented echoes. Tales of those who had vanished, of servitors that had malfunctioned in unlikely sequences, of custodes that appeared suddenly and vanished without sound, all coalesced into an atmosphere of terror and awe. These were the results of the Emperor's subtle will, enacted through both mechanical proxies and unseen presences. Fear had become obedience, and obedience was both shield and measure. Any lapse, however minor, risked invoking a consequence that was immediate and irrevocable. Marek passed a maintenance hub where a cluster of data slates displayed irregularities, deviations in workflow, slight misalignments in servitor calibration, and anomalies in ritualized litanies. These fragments of information, invisible to the untrained eye, were cataloged and interpreted. The shadow, if it existed as laborers believed, was not haphazard in its judgment. It moved with inexorable patience, gathering data, weighing intent, and preparing for its moment of reckoning. Marek felt the pressure increase, a sensation that was both psychological and almost tangible, as if the very air of the hive had thickened, pressing inward from every direction. The reckoning, when it came, was never loud. It did not arrive with fanfare nor with chaos. Instead, it was a quiet, deliberate unraveling of errors and hesitations. A misaligned cog in a servitor, a flinched prayer, a pause in the rhythm of work. Each could trigger a sequence of observation, judgment, and enforcement. Marek witnessed a laborer collapse suddenly, not from fire or injury, but as if the weight of observation itself had struck. A subtle but undeniable removal executed by Custodes in silent precision. Each incident reinforced the lattice of obedience. The message clear. The shadow, or the Emperor's will acting through it, was omnipresent, omniscient, and inexorably patient. As he moved deeper into the manufactorum, the interplay of fire, light, and shadow created illusions that were nearly indistinguishable from reality. Figures appeared and vanished in peripheral vision. Mechanical sounds shifted in impossible directions, and the hiss of promethium seemed to echo with intent. Marek understood that the hive had become both trap and crucible, testing not only physical skill but psychological resilience, the endurance of faith, and the capacity to survive under constant, unknowable scrutiny. The weight of observation pressed hardest upon those who questioned, who wondered, who glimpsed beyond the machinery and ritual into the possibility of fragments acting independently, of the Emperor's consciousness extending into corridors, conduits, and servitor pathways. Each thought of defiance, each curiosity about hidden forces was recorded, weighed, and silently addressed. Marek felt a shiver of understanding. The reckoning was not a singular event but a continuum, unfolding in perfect patience, a manifestation of the Emperor's will or the fear it inspired. As he paused at a junction overlooking a partially extinguished forge, the orange glow from molten promethium reflected off the polished armor of a custodian. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and the faint hum of servitors seemed almost musical in its precision. Marek knew without doubt that he was being observed, tested, measured, not by chance but by a deliberate calculus of judgment that extended beyond flesh and machinery. The reckoning of shadows was the inevitable culmination of obedience, fear, and deviation, and Hive Helios itself had become both stage and instrument for its execution. The fires of Hive Helios had long since died to embers, yet the heat lingered in the walls, the floors, and the minds of those who survived. Marek walked among the aftermath, the corridors scarred by promethium, echoing with the faint hum of servitors returning to duty, and the slow, deliberate footfalls of Custodes patrolling the upper tiers. Silence had settled over the manufactorum like a heavy cloak, but it was a silence that carried weight, the kind that pressed on the chest and forced the heart to measure each beat against memory, against obedience, against survival. He paused on a grated balcony overlooking the central forge, where molten metal still glimmered faintly in pools cooled by time, but not yet by conscience. The hive bore the scars of judgment, twisted metal, scorched servitors, absence where life had once been vibrant. Laborers moved cautiously, their voices hushed, eyes cast downward, fingers tracing the faint symbols of litanies worn into walls. Each action was a measure of devotion. Each pause was a negotiation with forces both corporeal and spectral. The Emperor's will had been enacted subtly, absolutely, and without mercy. Whispers of apotheosis filled the quieter spaces of the hive, rumors carried in half-spoken words and silent glances. Some claimed fragments of the Emperor had passed unseen, measuring, correcting, and perhaps even guiding. Others suggested that the fires themselves were a ritual, a deliberate crucible meant to purify obedience, expose defiance, and leave the faithful tempered like promethium-forged steel. Marek had no way of confirming these tales, yet the sensation of scrutiny remained palpable. Faith and fear had merged into a single, inseparable force shaping action, thought, and breath itself. The Custodes moved through the remnants with deliberate calm, golden armor reflecting the dim glow of embers, their presence a tangible manifestation of authority and inevitability. Skitarii followed, their augmented limbs precise and unyielding, scanning every movement, every alignment, every moment of hesitation. Even the machinery seemed aware, humming in synchrony with the lattice of vigilance that stretched from the forges to the highest walkways. The hive itself had become a living testament to obedience, a cathedral of fear, ritual, and survival. Marek felt the weight of judgment press upon him more acutely than ever. The fires had burned not just flesh and metal but the fabric of doubt, leaving behind a refined fear that tempered the heart and mind. Those who had survived understood instinctively that obedience was survival, devotion was armor, and questioning, however silent or concealed, was a peril that lingered with every step. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in the glow of dying embers, and in them, Marek thought he glimpsed the faint outline of something greater. Perhaps the shadow, perhaps a fragment of the Emperor, perhaps the mind of the hive itself extended into perception beyond mortal comprehension. The manufactorum, though scarred, had resumed its rhythm, but it was a rhythm changed forever. Machinery moved with deliberate caution, laborers acted with measured reverence, and the custodes and Skitarii patrolled with vigilant, unyielding precision. Hive Helios had been purged and tested. It had been remade in the image of unwavering obedience. Every corner, every shadow, every trace of heat or light now carried the imprint of judgment, a reminder that defiance had a cost measured in flesh, fire, and silence. As Marek descended into the lower levels, the final traces of embers glimmered faintly, reflecting off pools of molten promethium and twisted machinery. He understood now that the fires, the shadow, the whispers of apotheosis, and the unblinking gaze of the Custodes were all aspects of a single truth. The Emperor's will, whether enacted through flesh, machine, or rumor, was absolute. Survival was not merely a matter of skill, of labor, or of obedience. It was a covenant with a presence that transcended life, machinery, and mortal comprehension. The hive exhaled, the echoes of fire fading into the hum of machinery and ritualized devotion. Marek walked among the ashes, carrying the knowledge of survival, the weight of obedience, and the inescapable truth of the Emperor's gaze. Faith and fear had fused into one, leaving behind a hive tempered in promethium and prayer, a testament to the cost of defiance and a lingering question that would never be answered. How far did the Emperor's will truly extend, and who among the living would be called to meet it next? In the quiet, amid the scorched metal and cooling promethium, Marek felt a strange serenity mixed with dread. Hive Helios had endured, yet the lessons of fire, shadow, and judgment were indelibly imprinted on every soul. In the Imperium, survival demanded more than life. It demanded devotion, vigilance, and the understanding that the Emperor's will, in whatever form it manifested, was absolute. And in that truth, the hive and all who walked its corridors were forever bound to the echoes of ashes and apotheosis.